Welcome to Narrative Lab.
It is, it's really good to be back in the lab.
Yeah, today we're attempting to wrap our heads around something that is, frankly, just too big to wrap your head around. We aren't talking about a city. We aren't even really talking about a planet. We are talking about an object in space that blurs the line between those two things so thoroughly that the distinction kind of just becomes meaningless. We're doing a deep dive into Coruscant.
The jewel of the core, the city that spans an entire world.
In Ecumenopolis,
Yeah.
to use the $50 word. And I want to start right there with the sheer scale of this thing. Because I think when you watch the visual media or play the games, you see the skyline, you see the flying cars, and you just think, oh, cool, big city.
Right. Yeah.
But you don't really process what it means to actually pave over an entire planetary surface.
No, because it defies instinct. I mean, as a species, we are used to cities being interruptions in nature.
Right.
A city is a clearing in a forest, or it's a settlement on a river. But Coruscant is the total inversion of that. Nature is the interruption, if it even exists at all. The city is the default state of the entire sphere.
And that centrality isn't just physical, right?
Yeah.
It's heavily psychological. I was looking at the navigational data in our source stack for this deep dive, and this really struck me. In a galaxy of millions of stars, how do you decide where the exact center is?
You just claim it.
Exactly. Coruscant
Okay.
just decided it was the center.
That's a really great point to start on, because if you look at the standard galactic star charts in the archives, the XYZ coordinates for Coruscant are literally 0, 0, 0.
000.
Precisely, 000. And we really need to pause on the sheer arrogance of that. In astrophysics, there is no actual center of space.
Yeah.
You could put the 0 point on Tatooine or Hoth if you really wanted to. But by claiming 0, 0, 0, Coruscant wasn't just establishing a location, it was establishing a hierarchy.
Yeah, it was saying, we are the protagonists of this galaxy.
Yes. Every other system is defined solely by its distance from us.
It's basically cartographic imperialism.
It absolutely is. It's the navigational anchor for the entire galactic civilization. Politics, economics, culture, it all radiates outward from this single specific point. If you are on Coruscant, you matter. And if you are out in the outer rim, you are, by definition, marginal.
And the name itself totally reinforces that, Coruscant. I did a little digging into the etymology here because the word sounds so sharp, almost elegant. It turns out it derives from the Latin word coruscant, which means vibrating or glittering. It comes from the verb coruscare.
Which is perfectly descriptive if you think about it. If you look at the archival descriptions of the planet as viewed from deep space, it doesn't actually look like a habitable world.
No.
It doesn't look like a blue marble or a green and blue jewel like Alderaan or Earth could.
No, it looks completely artificial.
It looks like a bioluminescent ball. It's often described in the text as a Coruscant gem. Because the city lights never go out, the entire surface is covered in heady urbanization. So from orbit, you are literally seeing the glow of trillions of interweaving lives.
Yeah.
It's vibrating with energy. It's beautiful in a way, but it's also fundamentally terrifying.
Terrifying is definitely the right word.
Yeah.
Because that is our mission for this deep dive today. For everyone listening, we aren't just here to look at the pretty lights. We want to unpack the layers, literally and metaphorically, of the most important planet in this galaxy.
The center of it all.
Right. I want to understand how you physically sustain a population that the sources estimate at 3 trillion people on a rock that has 0 natural resources left.
That is the essential paradox of the planet.
And I also want to understand how the history of this world, the stuff that's literally buried under the concrete, mirrors the rise and fall of the galactic governments that ruled it. Because you have this shining surface, but underneath you have thousands of years of rot, secrets, and things people tried really hard to forget.
If you understand Coruscant, you understand the galaxy. It is the ultimate case study in a civilization pushing itself to the absolute physical limit.
So let's grab our hard hats and go straight into the infrastructure. Segment 1, the engineering of an Ecumenopolis.
Or how to defy physics and biology on a planetary scale.
Yeah, pretty much. Because we really have to start with the people. The official census data usually puts the population around 1 trillion permanent residents.
Which, frankly, is a joke.
You think it's a low ball?
Oh, it's a massive lowball. That number likely only accounts for citizens with full identification numbers who are living in the upper and mid-levels.
Ah, the people on the grid.
Exactly. When you factor in the transients, the undocumented workers, the refugees, and the billions upon billions of beings living totally off the grid in the lower levels, people who haven't seen a census droid in 10 generations. Most xenobiologists and sociologists put the real number closer to 3 trillion.
3 trillion. I'm just trying to visualize that.
Yeah.
That is roughly 300 times the entire population of Earth, all crammed onto one single sphere.
And keep in mind, that sphere has no farmland. It has no rivers. It has no open oceans.
So the driving question for this segment is simple. How do they not die? How do you feed, water, and provide air for 3 trillion people on a planet made of steel?
You force the planet to work. Coruscant is an entirely artificial ecosystem at this point. Biologically speaking, it is dead. It shouldn't work. It is only forced to function through absolute brute force engineering every single second of every day.
Wow.
So let's start with the most immediate biological need, water.
Yeah, I read the technical manuals on this part of the source material, and it's impressive, but it's also kind of horrifying.
It's highly efficient. It has to be.
The sources explicitly say there are no natural oceans left.
None. Zero. They were completely drained thousands of generations ago.
Drained? Where did an entire ocean go?
Well, they needed the space. As the city expanded, land value became infinite. So they literally drained the oceans and built massive foundations directly on the seabeds. The water itself was moved into massive subterranean caverns and artificial aquifers deep within the planet's crust.
So the oceans are technically still there, they're in the basement.
In a giant tank, essentially, yes. But that standing reserve isn't nearly enough to actually sustain the daily usage of the population. The water system on Coruscant operates as a completely closed loop.
A closed loop. See, that is a very polite, sterile way of saying something very, very gross.
It means exactly what you suspect it means. The water you drink on Coruscant has been drunk by someone else before, probably millions of times over.
So we're talking about recycled sewage.
Recycled everything. Sewage, industrial runoff, atmospheric condensation, shower drains, it all goes right back into the system. Giant recirculation pumps, and we are talking machinery the size of mountains here, push this water back up through the spires. It passes through filtration and scrubbing technology that is arguably the best in the galaxy.
I mean, it would absolutely have to be.
Chemically speaking, the water coming out of a tap in the Senate district is purer than natural spring water. But psychologically, yes, you are drinking highly refined, recycled waste.
Is there any new water entering the system at all? Or is it just the exact same water circling the drain forever?
The only source of what we would call fresh water comes from the polar ice caps. The ancient engineers left the poles somewhat intact, mostly because building up there is incredibly difficult due to the cold, but also specifically to keep this resource. They melt the ice and pipe it down to the temperate zones.
Pipelines running all the way from the North Pole down to the equator.
Massive ones. But even that is heavily, heavily managed. You don't just get water on Coruscant. It is a strictly controlled utility that is tracked down to the very drop.
Okay, so we have the water sorted out. Now let's talk about breeding. Because again, there are no trees, there's no algae. You have 3 trillion people exhaling carbon dioxide constantly, plus millions of factories and ships spewing exhaust into the air.
If you or I stood on the surface of Coruscant without the planetary life support systems active, we would likely suffocate or die of severe heat stroke within a matter of hours.
So the planet inherently wants to kill you.
The planet is just trying to reach a new natural equilibrium, which happens to be highly toxic to oxygen breathers. To combat this, the Republic and later the Empire maintained the Passerian Memorial Atmospheric Reclamation Complex project.
That is a massive mouthful of a name for what is essentially a giant air conditioner.
It's a planetary lung system. It consists of thousands of scrubbing stations and CO2 reactive atmospheric dampeners located way up in the upper atmosphere.
How does that actually work mechanically?
It's active filtration.
Yeah.
These orbital and high atmosphere stations suck in the smog and the CO2, chemically separate the carbon, and synthesize oxygen to pump right back out. They also regulate the air pressure.
Right, because of the height.
Exactly. Because the buildings are so impossibly high, some of these towers reach literal kilometers into the sky. The air pressure difference between the penthouse and the lobby would be severe. These dampeners equalize it so you don't get the bends just taking an elevator down to the street.
But the sheer fragility of that system terrifies me.
Yeah.
The sources clearly mention that without these scrubbers, the atmosphere would completely degenerate within days.
Days, maybe even less. If a terrorist group or a hostile fleet managed to take out the reclamation complex, Coruscant dies. It's an entire civilization civilization living on a ventilator.
And speaking of ventilators and temperature control, we have to talk about the mirrors.
Yeah.
Because this was a visual detail from the sources that I found really compelling.
The orbital solar energy transfer satellites.
Oh, right, because the problem is the shadows. You have these skyscrapers that are so incredibly tall, they block out the sun for the lower levels basically forever. But you also have uneven heating. The equator is burning hot and the poles are freezing.
And the planet generates an immense amount of its own heat. Between the heavy machinery, the friction of the ships, and just the body heat of trillions of beings, Coruscant creates a heat island effect that is visible on thermal scanners from light years away. But it's not distributed evenly at all.
So they use mirrors.
Massive orbital mirrors. Their entire job is to reflect raw sunlight. They direct it to the poles to melt that ice we talked about earlier, and they direct it to the frozen latitudes that wouldn't normally get enough natural light to be habitable.
It's literally like using a giant magnifying glass to warm up cold spots on a dinner plate.
A very precise, incredibly high-stakes magnifying glass, and what's fascinating is the culture around the people who actually operate them.
Yes, the mirror caretakers.
Colloquially called riding the mirrors, these are solitary orbital stations. You have one or two people living in a tiny capsule in orbit attached to a giant sheet of reflective material. Their entire job is to tilt the glass a fraction of a degree to make sure a district on the surface down below doesn't freeze over.
It sounds incredibly lonely, but also sort of poetic in a way. You are essentially the lighthouse keeper for the sun.
It definitely draws a certain type of person, highly introverted, incredibly diligent, because if they fall asleep on the job or let the array drift out of alignment, they could accidentally boil an entire city block or let a vital reservoir freeze solid.
Okay, so we've hydrated the people, we've given them breathable air, we've kept them warm with giant space mirrors. Now we have to deal with the direct result of all that life. The waste.
The output.
The numbers here are just staggering to read. Trillions of tons of waste produced every single hour.
Every hour. Just try to picture what a trillion tons of garbage looks like. It's a mountain, a new mountain every hour.
And you can't exactly dig a hole in the backyard and bury it when your backyard is just your neighbor's roof.
Exactly. So aggressive recycling is the first line of defense. The efficiency of Coruscant's recycling systems makes our current real-world technology look like banging rocks together. Almost everything is broken down.
Everything.
Clothes, packaging, biological waste, structural debris, it all gets mulched, chemically separated, and turned right back into raw material for the factories.
So one man's trash is literally another man's living room wall.
Literally. But there are obviously things you can't recycle. Highly hazardous materials. Degraded hyperdrive cores, toxic byproducts from Tibanna gas refinement.
So what do they do with the really bad stuff?
They look up, they use orbital cannons.
Garbage cannons.
Basically, yeah. They pack the hazardous waste into heavily reinforced canisters and literally fire them into low orbit. Up there, garbage scows these massive, ugly industrial ships, collect the canisters with tractor beams.
And take them where?
Usually to the moons. Coruscant's moons are essentially radioactive dumping grounds at this point. Or if the waste is particularly dangerous or volatile, they skip the moons and fire it directly into the local sun, Coruscant Prime.
Fired right into the sun. It's the ultimate delete button.
It works. But not everything makes it to the cannons. And this brings us to one of the most infamous examples of urban planning gone totally wrong. The granite slugs.
Oh man, I love this story. In a totally horrified way, this is easily my favorite creature feature fact from the deep dive.
It's a classic case of introducing a biological species to solve a mechanical problem and creating an infinitely worse problem.
So let's set the scene for you listening. Centuries ago, the lower levels are getting clogged with heavy refuse that the standard recyclers just can't handle.
Right. So the municipal authorities think we need a biological agent to break this stuff down, so they import granite slugs.
Okay.
These are silicon-based life forms that naturally eat duracrete, brick, and heavy refuse. They're essentially living garbage disposals.
Which sounds like a pretty great idea on paper.
On paper, yes. But they completely forgot that Coruscant offers an unlimited food supply.
An endless, all-you-can-eat buffet.
The slugs didn't just eat the trash. They thrived on it. They mutated. They grew.
How big are we actually talking here?
Down in the deep undercity, there are verified reports of granite slugs the size of speeder trucks. And here's the kicker. They stop just eating garbage.
They started eating the residents.
They became apex predators. So now, if you live down in the lower levels, you don't just have to worry about muggers or structural collapse. You have to actively worry about a 6-ton slug bursting through your apartment wall because it smelled your organic matter.
It is the perfect metaphor for Coruscant as a whole. You try to engineer this perfect sterile system, and nature just finds a way to turn it into an absolute nightmare in the basement.
It perfectly highlights the friction between the ideal of the city, the shining jewel, and the grim reality. And that friction isn't just biological. It's strictly geographical. Because Coruscant isn't the same place for everyone.
No, absolutely not. And that leads us perfectly into segment 2, vertical geography.
The stratification of society, literally casting concrete.
I think this is the hardest thing for people to visualize about the planet. We are used to cities spreading outward. New York, Tokyo, London. They sprawl across the land. But Coruscant stopped sprawling thousands of years ago because it ran out of land. It only had one way to go, up.
It's a vertical timeline. The higher you go, the newer the building. The lower you go, the older the structure.
And the class divide maps perfectly onto that altitude.
It's not subtle at all. In most societies, wealth buys you sprawling space or extreme privacy. On Coruscant, wealth buys you altitude. It buys you the sky.
Let's start right at the top, the upper levels.
Level 527 is the designated surface level.
5,127 levels. That is just baffling to think about.
And that's just the officially counted levels. The surface is the exclusive domain of the super rich, the politicians, the 500 Republica elite. This is the shiny Coruscant we see in the prequel movies.
It's gorgeous up there.
It is. It's sleek. It's remarkably clean. The air you breathe up there has been freshly scrubbed by the atmospheric reclamators. You are bathing in actual natural sunlight from the mirrors.
You can see the stars at night.
That is a massive luxury item. Actually, seeing the stars is a status symbol on Coruscant. The transport is totally seamless. The sky lanes. These are auto navigation streams where luxury speeders move at hundreds of kilometers an hour, perfectly synchronized by traffic computers. It's a completely friction-free existence.
But the sheer physics of the city force everything else down. So let's hit the down button on the elevator. As we descend from 5 to 127, what changes?
The light goes first. As you pass down through the mid-levels, the natural light gets completely blocked by the mega structures up above. You start relying entirely on artificial illumination.
The classic sodium glow.
Exactly. Neon signs, industrial flares, harsh floodlights. By the time you reach the underworld, the really deep levels, sunlight is literally a myth. It's something people only hear about in stories.
And the air changes too.
Drastically. We talked about the planetary ventilation, but down there, the air gets totally trapped. It's thick. It's heavy with the exhaust of 5,000 levels above it.
The sources mentioned microclimates. I found that fascinating.
It is fascinating. The spaces between these massive structural buildings are like deep canyons. They are kilometers deep. The intense heat from the lower machinery rises, the cold air from the surface sinks, and the ambient moisture gets trapped. You can actually have violent rainstorms inside the lower levels.
Rain created entirely by dirty air and air conditioning runoff.
Yes. Thunder and lightning, created entirely by industrial byproduct. It creates a gloomy, perpetual twilight zone.
And this is where we find level 1313.
The most infamous address in the entire galaxy.
Level 1313 is basically a universally understood code word for lawless.
It's deep enough that the Jedi and the planetary police essentially ignore it entirely, but it's high enough that it's still somewhat functional. It became a massive hub for bounty hunters, smugglers, and various crime syndicates.
So if you want to buy illegal spice or hire an assassin or just completely disappear from the Empire's records, you go down to 1313.
It has its own isolated ecosystem, its own shadow economy. It's like a massive subterranean pirate ship that stretches for an entire planet.
But you can go even deeper. What happens if you just keep going down?
You eventually hit the single digits, level 5, level 2, level 1.
The absolute bottom of the barrel.
This area is officially deemed uninhabitable by the government, though things definitely do live there. Mutants, the giant slugs we mentioned, and the truly desperate. Level 1 is a chaotic mix of ancient, crumbling ruins. The original cities of Coruscant from 100,000 years ago, and the actual planetary crust.
The literal ground.
The real ground. But it's pitch dark, it's freezing cold, and it's completely covered in the runoff of over 5,000 levels of civilization. It's likely highly radioactive in places, totally toxic in others. It is the graveyard of the planet.
It really paints a picture of the planet as a giant tomb. The rich live on the shiny lid of the coffin, and the poor are buried alive inside it.
That's a grim analogy, but a very accurate one.
Speaking of the real ground, is there any part of the natural planet that actually reaches the surface? Or is it literally 100% a metal shell at the top?
There's one exception, just one, the Mannarai Mountains.
Mannarai Mountains.
Specifically, just the twin peaks of the mountains. They are so incredibly tall that the city built up around them over millennia, but didn't quite manage to cover the very tips.
So you have these two jagged rocks just sticking out of the metal ocean.
Yes, they are fiercely preserved in what is called Monument Plaza, built right around the peak of Mount Umate. It's a massive tourist attraction. And just think about how strange that is. Citizens of Coruscant flock to this plaza, stand in long lines just to physically touch a rock.
Because for them, a natural rock is an alien material.
It's a total novelty. Look, raw stone. It hasn't been processed in a foundry. It connects them to a deep history they have completely lost touch with.
There was a detail in the High Republic archives that really broke my heart regarding this specific plaza.
Oh, the gardening project.
Yeah. During the High Republic era, which was a slightly more optimistic, peaceful time, the city planners tried to add greenery around Monument Plaza. They wanted to create a park that mimicked what the ancient planet might have looked like.
But there was a rather large problem.
They didn't actually know what it looked like.
No one did. The biological records were entirely lost to time.
So they were up there planting trees and bushes based on a complete guess. They were simulating nature because the real nature had been erased so thoroughly that even the memory of it was gone.
It's a museum exhibit for a murdered world, built directly on the corpse of that world.
That is... man, that's heavy.
Coruscant is heavy. It's a place of immense weight, physically, historically, and emotionally.
Which is a perfect segue to segment 3. Key landmarks and secrets. Because a place this incredibly old and this stratified is bound to have massive secrets buried in the walls.
It's a city of ghosts.
Let's start with the most obvious landmark, the one everyone listening immediately knows. The Senate District.
The Federal District. This is the iconic mushroom-shaped Senate building where the floating repulsor pods are. It's the political heart of the entire galaxy.
And right next door to it, you have the 500 Republica Tower that we mentioned earlier.
The most exclusive residential address in existence.
This is where Palpatine lived, right?
Yes, he had a massive, sprawling penthouse suite there. It's also where he and Anakin Skywalker sat and watched that bizarre bubble opera.
Oh, Squid Lake.
Something like that, yeah. But notice the geographical proximity. The elite residential power and the ultimate political power are clustered tightly together, physically walled off and separated from the rest of the planet.
But looking across the skyline from there is another structure that completely dominates the view. The Jedi Temple.
The Grand Ziggurat. For 1,000 years, this was the ultimate symbol of peace. It sits high up, 5 spires reaching for the sky. It looks tranquil.
It looks holy, honestly.
It does. But here's where the history gets fascinating and incredibly dark. We naturally think of the Jedi Temple as a pure beacon of the light side of the Force.
Right.
But do you know what's directly underneath it?
I do, and this genuinely blew my mind when I first read it in the sources. Tell everyone what the Jedi actually built their house on.
They built it right on top of a Sith shrine.
A literal functioning shrine to the dark side.
The shrine in the depths. About 5,000 years ago, or perhaps even longer, the Sith completely controlled Coruscant. They identified a sacred spire, a natural mountain peak deep down that was an incredibly powerful vergence in the Force.
A nexus of power.
And they deliberately built a shrine there to corrupt it, to turn the natural vergence into a fountain of dark energy.
So when the Jedi eventually won the war and kicked the Sith off the planet, they had a choice. Destroy the shrine or...
They chose to cap it. They raised the upper superstructure but purposely left the foundations intact. Then they built the massive Jedi Temple directly on top of the Sith ruins.
What was the logic there? Was it just a victory lap, like we are permanently standing on your neck?
Partly symbolic dominance, yes. But also, they genuinely believed that the sheer presence of thousands of light side users living, training, and meditating there every day would neutralize the darkness. They thought they could contain the leak.
It's like building a peaceful nursery on top of a leaking nuclear waste dump and hoping good vibes keep the radiation away.
That is a disturbingly accurate analogy, because, spoiler alert, it didn't work.
It leaked.
Over millennia, the dark side energy didn't just vanish. It seeped upward. It slowly infiltrated the very foundations of the temple.
So when we watch the prequel era, and Yoda says, the dark side clouds everything, Or Mace Windu mentions that their ability to use the Force is diminished.
It's not just a poetic metaphor for the political state of the galaxy, it is literal. They were physically sitting on top of a geyser of dark energy that was slowly, imperceptibly poisoning their connection to the Force.
That adds such a deeply tragic layer to their eventual fall. They were compromised by their own hubris. They thought they were so pure they could just sit on top of concentrated evil and it wouldn't affect them.
It's the Coruscant principle playing out again. Build something pretty on top of something highly dangerous and just hope the dangerous thing goes away. But the foundation always affects the structure above it.
Let's move to a very different kind of buried secret. A place known as the Works.
The industrial graveyard.
This place sounds incredibly creepy in the texts. It's described as an abandoned industrial zone.
It is. Centuries ago, the Works was the beating manufacturing heart of the city. Factories, foundries, massive assembly lines churning out goods. But as Coruscant became more gentrified and focused on politics and finance, real estate became far too expensive for factories.
So they outsourced the labor.
They moved the heavy manufacturing off-world to other planets entirely. The Works was simply abandoned, left to rot.
A ghost town the size of a medium country.
Filled with rusting machinery, leaking chemical pipes, and deep shadows, so naturally it became a massive hideout for criminals.
And for Sith Lords.
Indeed. This is exactly where Darth Sidious Palpatine and Count Dooku held their secret treasonous meetings.
The visuals of that are so thematically perfect. The two secret architects of the galaxy's destruction meeting in the broken, rusted shell of the planet's industrial past.
It perfectly represents the decay hidden within the Republic. The shiny Democratic Senate building is just a few kilometers away, but here, in the rust and the toxic leaks, is where the real decisions about the future are being made.
Okay, that's all very grim and shadowy. Is there anywhere on this planet that's actually nice? Or at least lively in a good, normal way?
Well, there is Cocoa Town.
Cocoa Town, which is short for collective commerce.
It's a solid mid-level area. It's not the hyper-elite surface, but it's definitely not the dangerous underworld of 1313. It's the working middle class, essentially.
This is where Dex's Diner is located.
Exactly. And just think about the vibe there. It's a busy diner. You have a four-armed basilisk cook running the grill. You have droid waitresses. You have Jedi like Obi-Wan Kenobi just stopping by for a casual cup of Java.
It actually feels like a real community.
It's one of the very few places we see where the rigid, literal stratification blurs a bit. Different species mix freely. Normal business happens. It shows that despite the massive, sterile engineering and the rigid class structure, daily life finds a way to be messy and organic. It's the actual heartbeat of the city, totally away from the grand politics.
So we've thoroughly covered the geography, the intense engineering, and the major landmarks. But a city this incredibly old has layers of time just as thick as its layers of concrete. Let's move to segment 4, a history of names and rulers.
Or the identity crisis of the core.
It really is an identity crisis. It seems like every single time a new management team comes in, they forcefully change the name on the door. But let's go way, way back, long before it was ever called Coruscant.
In the ancient days, long before the Galactic Republic was even an idea, the planet was called Notron.
Notron. I have to say, it sounds like a retro-futuristic robot from a bad 50s B-movie.
It really does. And at this early time, it wasn't a sprawling city planet. It was a rugged world defined by fierce tribal warfare between two dominant indigenous species, the Gel and the Tong.
The Gel were the early ancestors of humans, right?
That's the prevailing anthropological theory in the archives. They were the dominant early human species. The Tong, on the other hand, were a strict warrior culture. They brutally fought for control of the planet for centuries.
And then the planet itself actually intervened in the war.
A massive, cataclysmic volcanic eruption. The ash clouds were so thick they blocked out the sun for years. The Gel were nearly wiped out by the environmental fallout. The Tong, however, took this ash cloud as a literal divine sign. They started calling themselves the Warriors of Shadow because they fought in the darkness of the ash.
But the Gel actually bounced back from that.
They were incredibly resilient. They regrouped, fought back, and eventually drove the Tong entirely off-world. And here is a historical connection that usually blows people's minds. Do you know what happened to those exiled Tong?
I do, and this is probably one of my absolute favorite lore nuggets we found.
They traveled out to a new world, they conquered it, and they renamed themselves after their war leader, Mandalore the First.
They became the Mandalorians.
Yes. The Mandalorians, the galaxy's most feared warriors, were essentially the losers of the ancient battle for Coruscant. Their entire cultural identity of wandering, of wearing full armor, of constant war, stems directly from being violently kicked off their home planet by humans.
Man, that really explains the grudge they have against the Republic later on.
It explains a whole lot about their psychology.
So humans take over Neutron. Then, much later, the Rakata show up.
The Infinite Empire. This was a very dark period. The Rakata were an amphibious species that used dark side-infused technology to enslave entire worlds. They enslaved the human population of Neutron, now becoming Coruscant, and used them as literal slave labor to build their massive monuments.
But the humans revolted eventually.
Eventually, yes. A devastating plague weakened the Rakaya, and the humans rose up, violently took back their world, and began the incredibly long process of building what would become the Galactic Republic.
And that leads us to the Coruscant we mostly know, the Republic era, the jewel of the core.
For 1,000 uninterrupted years, it was the shining center of democracy. The grand rotunda of the Senate was the ultimate image of civilization and diplomacy.
Until the applause died down and the Empire rose up, and the Imperial rebranding machine kicked into high gear.
Palpatine didn't just want to take over the government. He wanted to entirely rewrite the physical and psychological identity of the planet itself. He officially renamed it Imperial Center.
Which is just the most boring, soulless, authoritarian name imaginable. Imperial Center. It sounds like a regional logistics hub.
That was exactly the point. Total order, rigid structure, absolutely no frivolity or history.
And he fundamentally changed the look of the place.
Drastically. He took the Jedi Temple, the ultimate symbol of the Old Guard, and selfishly converted it into the Imperial Palace.
He literally moved into their house.
He expanded it massively. It became a sprawling pyramidal structure, officially the largest building on the entire planet. He literally lived on top of the bones of his enemies, on top of the Jedi, on top of the ancient Sith shrine. It was a towering, layered cake of pure conquest.
And for the average everyday citizen, daily life changed too.
The whole aesthetic shifted from the elegant, sweeping curves of the Republic to the brutalist, sharp, intimidating lines of the Empire. But sociologically, it was much worse. They created the Alien Protection Zone.
Which is an incredibly dark euphemism if I've ever heard one.
It was forced segregation, pure and simple. The Empire was strictly human-centric. Non-humans were violently pushed out of sight, walled off into heavily guarded ghettos. The cosmopolitan, diverse mix of places like Cocoa Town was entirely replaced by strict divisions, checkpoints, and fear.
So eventually the Empire falls, the New Republic rises.
Yeah.
You'd naturally think, great, Coruscant is back, party time, let's turn the lights back on.
You would think that. But the New Republic made a highly controversial political decision. They looked at Coruscant and saw a lingering symbol of centralized, corrupt power, the exact thing that allowed Palpatine to take over in the first place. So they decided to aggressively decentralize.
They actually moved the capital.
They established a rotating capital system. It moved to Chandrila, then eventually to Hosnian Prime.
Imagine telling New Yorkers or Londoners, hey, the entire government and the entire financial sector are permanently moving to a nice mid-sized town in the Midwest. Good luck.
It was economically devastating for Coruscant. The entire economy of the planet was built entirely on being the capital. Without the Senate, without the highly paid lobbyists, without the massive fleet command, the money just stopped flowing.
So what actually happened to the city?
It fell into a severe, rapid decline. By the time of the sequel era, Coruscant had become a hollowed-out shadow of itself.
The sources specifically mention intense gang wars.
Even the highly respectable elite surface levels fell into utter lawlessness. Tourism completely vanished. The infrastructure started to fail catastrophically because they literally couldn't afford the immense upkeep on the weather mirrors and the deep water pumps.
It basically became a planetary rust belt.
It became a glaring symbol of disturbing realities. It was a harsh warning that even the absolute center of the universe can be completely forgotten if the money leaves.
Now, speaking of being forgotten, or repressed is the better word here, we have to take a major sidestep. Because there is an alternate history deep in the archives.
Ah, the Legends timeline.
For everyone listening, this is the story continuity that existed before the current canon was established. And in that timeline, what happened to Coruscant makes a severe economic recession and a few gang wars look like a pleasant picnic.
This brings us to segment 5, The Yuzan Vong invasion.
If you thought the giant granite slugs were bad, just buckle up.
In the legend's continuity, about 25 years after the events of A New Hope, an extragalactic species called the Yuzan Vong invaded the galaxy.
And the key thing you need to know about the Vong is that they absolutely hated technology.
They completely despised it. They viewed any machines, droids, or computers as a vile abomination against their gods. Their entire civilization was built on biotech. Their ships were living creatures. Their weapons were genetically engineered snakes and bugs. Their armor was grown crab shell.
So you have a fanatical species that violently hates machines invading a planet that is 100% machine. It's the ultimate ideological clash.
And they won. They fully conquered Coruscant.
And they didn't just casually occupy it, they completely transformed it.
They renamed it Yuzan Tar, and they immediately began the violent process of Vong forming.
Vong forming, that sounds terrifying saying it out loud.
It was horrific. They systematically smashed the sky lanes. They deliberately toppled the massive skyscrapers. They introduced massive, rapid growth alien vegetation that physically strangled the remaining buildings.
They turned the ultimate steel canyon into a literal jungle.
A highly carnivorous jungle. They released engineered mosses that rapidly ate duracrete and steel. They effectively tried to erase the city entirely and return the planet to nature, but a very twisted, highly hostile, alien version of nature.
I remember reading about the Rainbow Bridge. That was wild.
That was a massive show of force. They destroyed one of Coruscant's natural moons using gravity-manipulating weapons, completely pulverizing it, and then smeared the rocky debris into a glittering planetary ring.
They literally rearranged the solar system just to make a theological point.
And in the Grand Senate building, that ultimate symbol of democracy and reason, they placed the world brain.
A world brain.
A massive, pulsating, highly intelligent biological entity. It acted as a living control center for the planet's radically new climate and ecosystem. It was a highly deliberate desecration. They took the seat of political reason and physically replaced it with a throbbing organic brain.
It's basically body horror on a planetary scale.
It was eventually reclaimed and painstakingly rebuilt by the Galactic Alliance, but the deep psychological scar remained. It proved just how incredibly fragile the steel shell of Coruscant really was against a determined force.
Whether it's the slow economic collapse in the current canon or the violent alien invasion in the Legends timeline, the core lesson seems to be exactly the same. Coruscant is always teetering right on the edge of destruction.
It truly is. It's a massive house of cards made of durasteel.
So what does this all actually mean for us as observers? Let's try to synthesize all of this in our outro.
Coruscant is the ultimate, undeniable paradox.
It really is. It's the absolute height of civilization. You have the grand opera, the beautiful art, the high-speed travel, the peak of democracy.
But it is simultaneously the absolute depth of depravity. Level 1313, the buried Sith shrines, the forced segregation of aliens. The fact that the pure water you drink is literally recycled sewage.
It is a planet that logically shouldn't exist. It is a complete biological impossibility. It is sustained only by massive, constant, frantic engineering and sheer political will.
We started this deep dive calling it the center of it all. And I think that still absolutely holds true. But if we connect this to the much bigger picture, looking at the whole history, the Sith shrine hidden beneath the Jedi, the violent gangsters hidden beneath the polite senators, the sewage aggressively recycled into water.
What's the overarching pattern there?
The pattern is that at the very center of the galaxy, everything is built directly on top of something it's desperately trying to hide.
It's a mass.
A glittering, vibrating mask. The jewel of the core is just an incredibly shiny veneer stretched over a very dark, very complex reality.
So here is the final provocative thought I want to leave you with today. We spend a lot of time as fans wishing we could visit these amazing worlds, seeing the glowing sky lanes, eating a meal at Texas Diner. But knowing what you know right now, knowing about the terrifying fragility of the air scrubbers, the giant slugs hunting in the basement, the dark Sith energy in the very foundation.
The real question is, would you actually want to be there?
Would you rather live in the absolute safety of the fake light on level 5127, knowing the whole thing is built on a massive lie? Or would you take your chances with the dangerous, raw freedom of the shadows down on level 1313?
Honestly, I think I'll take my chances with the granite slugs down below. At least down there, you know exactly where you stand. The danger is completely honest.
Huh. I don't know. I think
Perfect
I
period.
heavily prefer my air chemically scrubbed and my water nicely chilled. I might just stick to the sky lanes and try really, really hard not to look down.
Just don't think about where the water came from.
I never do. Thanks for joining us in the lamp.